They will tell you that marriages among the nobility are forged in heaven, blessed by God, and sanctified by love. They are lying, of course. They are forged in solicitors' offices, over ledgers of debt, in the cold arithmetic of a ruined estate needing an heir and a bankrupt name needing rescue. And yet once in a great while something happens in the middle of that arithmetic that no one in the room can explain, and the whole of London spends a season trying. What happened at Thornmere Abbey that morning was this. A duke got down on his knees in front of every soul who mattered in England, and the world went quiet. The chapel was full nearly to bursting, silk rustling against oak pews, breath fogging faintly in air that no amount of candlelight could warm, the old stone floor sweating its damp into slippered feet. They had come the way one comes to watch a house burn, with solemn faces and hungry eyes. The Duke of Thornmere was said to bury his brides the way other men buried debts, quietly, efficiently, and this one, a baronet's daughter with nothing to recommend her but a signature her father had scrawled to save himself, seemed destined to be the third such quiet burial. They had come to see the beginning of it. She came up the nave with her hem black to the knee, mud drying stiff along borrowed boots 2 sizes too large, her hair coming loose from its pins, her breath still not fully caught from 4 miles of English road. There was a silence at first, the particular silence of a room deciding, together, how cruel to be. It was Lady Everard, naturally, who broke it. Her voice carried the way certain voices are trained to carry, pitched for the back pew and the front page alike. "Surely the girl might be washed," she said, "before she is brought anywhere near an altar." A ripple of laughter, quickly swallowed, quickly relit in glances traded pew to pew. The bride did not look at her boots. She had long ago learned not to look down when the room wanted her to. It was the Duke who looked down. He came off the altar steps before the priest could so much as clear his throat, a big man, dark-coated, moving with that uneven, dragging gait everyone in that room had whispered about for years, the limp that had outlived 2 wives and acquired its own mythology. He crossed the stone floor slowly, deliberately, the sound of his bad leg loud in a church gone suddenly, perfectly silent, and then, in front of dukes and countesses and the whole assembled cruelty of the ton, he knelt. He drew a handkerchief from his coat, plain linen, no monogram anyone could later swear to, and he began, without a word to anyone, without so much as glancing up to see who watched, to wipe the mud from her boots. No one whispered after that. No one dared. Now let us go back, as these stories always insist on going back, to the morning that made such a scene possible at all. It had begun in a house that no longer felt like anyone's, the kind of ruin that does not announce itself with broken windows, but with smaller, sadder things. Dust, sheets over furniture sold in spirit if not yet in fact. A hallway clock that had stopped at some hour no one had bothered to correct, because time itself had become an embarrassment in that household, a reminder of debts accruing minute by minute while its master slept off the previous night's losses. She had risen before the rest of the house, as she always did, and dressed herself without calling for help, because there was no one left to call. The lady's maid had gone with the second footman, unpaid, 3 months prior. She had put on the gown chosen for her, not by her, a pale thing gone slightly yellow with storage, taken in at the waist by her own clumsy needle the night before, because there had been no money for a dressmaker's final fitting, for a wedding no one pretended was anything but a settlement. Downstairs, her father had not come to see her off. She had not expected him to. He had signed the contract 3 weeks prior in a room thick with candle smoke and the particular silence of a man who knows he has sold the only thing of value he had left. She had not been in the room when the pen touched paper. She had learned of it the way she learned of most things concerning her own life, second-hand, through a servant's lowered eyes, through a solicitor's letter left carelessly on a hall table. The carriage that came for her was hired, not sent, a detail the neighbors would remark upon for months, that a duke had not troubled to send his own conveyance for his bride, though the truth of that omission was more complicated than cruelty, and would not be understood by anyone in the county for some time yet. She had climbed into it with a single trunk, her mother's shawl, and a marriage contract she had never been permitted to read in full. She did not weep. She had promised herself, dressing in the cold that morning, that whatever else the day demanded of her, it would not have her tears. Those, at least, remained hers to withhold. The wheels had gone 4 miles smooth over frost-hard road, past hedgerows silvered with the season's first true cold, before the axle gave its terrible crack, and the driver, with the particular indifference of a man paid by the mile and not the mishap, informed her that he could go no further, that Thornmere Abbey lay ahead yet, that she had 2 legs and God had made roads for walking as well as riding. She stood a moment in the ruined road, looking at the driver as though she might argue him into decency and understanding, with the particular clarity that comes only to those who have already lost everything worth losing, that there was no argument to be had. He unhitched the good horse and rode off toward whatever village would pay him for his trouble, leaving the broken carriage tilted like a drunkard against the frozen ruts, and her standing beside it in a wedding dress that had cost more than her father's last quarter of servants' wages combined. She had, at least, the boots. They were not hers, her own slippers, pale silk embroidered at the toe, entirely unsuited to anything but a floor swept twice daily, sat uselessly in the trunk, and it had been the upstairs maid, a girl no older than herself with red knuckles and a kinder heart than her wages required, who had pressed a pair of scuffed half-boots into her hands that morning. "You'll want these under your hem, miss, in case," the girl had said, not knowing how prophetic the in case would prove, and Rosalind had thanked her without quite understanding why she felt the need to memorize the girl's face, as though it were the last kind thing she might be shown for some while. 4 miles. She had walked further as a girl, chasing dogs through her father's fields before the fields were sold, but she had not walked 4 miles in a gown built for standing still, in November air that found every seam of her cloak, on a road that had frozen hard the night before and thawed to a treacherous soup by mid-morning. The mud came first at the hem, then to the ankle, then, where the road dipped low near a stand of black elms, to the knee, cold and thick and utterly without mercy for silk or pride. She did not weep. She had made herself that promise. She thought, instead, in the practical, ledgering way her father never had, about what remained to her: 2 working legs, a whole heart despite what the last year had asked of it, and a name she was walking toward the ruin of, 4 miles at a time. She thought of her father's face when he had signed the contract, not meeting her eyes, and told himself it was mercy. She thought of the Duke she had never seen, a man the county called cold as his own stone halls, who had not troubled to send a carriage bearing his own crest, and wondered, without malice, only a terrible tiredness, what manner of welcome such a man imagined for a bride he had bought and never once glimpsed. The Abbey's gray towers rose at last above the tree-line, indifferent as weather, and she walked toward them with mud to her knee and her chin lifted in the only defiance left available to her. The boots were not her own. That was the detail she kept returning to, absurdly, as though it mattered more than anything else, that the boots eating blisters into her heels belonged to the innkeeper's daughter, a stout, kind-faced girl who had pressed them on her when the carriage wheel had splintered and the driver had merely shrugged, as if brides walked to their weddings every day of the week. They were half a size too small. She had felt the first raw place form somewhere around the 2nd mile, a small, furious burning above her left heel, and by the 3rd mile it had become something she no longer thought of as pain, but simply as company, a steady, insistent presence keeping pace beside the ache in her hips and the shivering that had settled deep into her jaw. Her hem she had given up on entirely. It had been white that morning, her mother's lace, taken in twice to fit her, the only inheritance her father's creditors had not thought worth seizing, and now it was a dark, ruined thing, heavy with wet earth, dragging at her ankles with every step like a hand trying to pull her back the way she had come. She could hear the stitches giving, somewhere near the waist, a small domestic sound of surrender beneath the larger, indifferent roar of the wind. She thought, "There will be nothing left of it by the time I reach the door." She thought, "Perhaps that is only fitting, for a dress bought with a debt." And beneath the blisters, beneath the cold climbing her calves, she did the sums, because sums were the only prayer she had ever been taught that seemed to work. A roof that did not leak, coal enough to see her father through another winter without her having to think of him at all, which was its own strange mercy. A name that could not be dragged through the papers again, at least not for gambling. Against this, a stranger's bed, a stranger's silences, a house she had heard called cold before she had ever seen its towers rise gray and closed-fisted above the elms. She turned the ledger over in her mind again and again, debit and credit, and could not make the columns balance into anything so simple as regret, only into a tiredness that sat on her chest like a stone laid there by someone else's hand. She did not know, walking the last half-mile with her jaw set and her borrowed boots weeping blood into wool stockings, that the man waiting at the altar had asked 3 times that morning whether the carriage had been sent, and 3 times been told, falsely, that it had. She did not know that his own boots were already wet from pacing the chapel steps, watching the road. She knew only the mud, and the cold, and the towers growing larger, and the particular grim comfort of counting what little was still hers to give away. Inside the chapel, the guests had already begun the work they did best, waiting, and while waiting, whispering. They spoke behind gloved hands and folded fans, in the particular hush the ton reserves for spectacles it does not wish to admit it has come to enjoy. They spoke of the man standing at the altar rail as though he were not 30 feet away and perfectly capable of hearing every word, which perhaps he was, and perhaps that was why he did not turn. He stood with the stillness of a man who had trained himself out of flinching, tall, dark-coated, his weight settled unevenly onto the good leg, in a way that had become so habitual it no longer looked like pain, only like architecture, some fixed and permanent lean to his bearing that the curious mistook for arrogance and the unkind mistook for guilt. The limp, they said, was from a fall taken years ago, though no 2 accounts agreed on the particulars. A horse, a staircase, a war he had not fought in but perhaps should have. The uncertainty suited him. A man who explained nothing gave gossip nothing to correct. They say the first one was found in her bed 3 days before anyone thought to send for a physician, murmured a matron in puce silk to her neighbor, not troubling to lower her voice past a register the whole 3rd pew could enjoy. Neglected, simply forgotten, in that great house, as if she were a piece of furniture no one had thought to dust. And the second, her neighbor supplied, with the relish of a woman handing over the final card in a winning hand, wasted away over a 12-month, some wasting fever. He would not send her to Bath, they say, would not send her anywhere, kept her here in all this damp until she simply stopped. "Two brides in the ground before 30, the first agreed, folding her fan shut with a small, satisfied click, as though closing a book she had read before and enjoyed. One must ask what manner of man does that to a house, or what manner of house does that to a man? No one asked it of him directly. No one ever did. They preferred him at a remove, a figure to be discussed rather than addressed, the Duke who buried brides, the Duke of the cold towers and the closed rooms, and they had come today, in their good coats and their careful indifference, for precisely this, to watch a third woman walk toward whatever waited for her here, and to have, by supper, something new to say. He did not look toward the doors yet. He had asked 3 times about the carriage, and been lied to 3 times, and some old, exhausted instinct in him, the same one that had once gone unheeded in a sick room, unheeded on a staircase, had already begun, quietly, to suspect the 4th answer would be worse than the first 3. The doors did not so much open as give way, shoved by hands too cold and too tired to manage the latch properly, and the sound they made, a groan of old hinges, a gust of wet wind carrying the smell of turned earth into a room thick with beeswax and incense, turned every head at once, which was, after all, precisely what they had come for. She stood in the threshold with the churchyard behind her, and 4 miles of England's worst road written plainly on her person. The hem of her gown had gone from cream to the color of a plowed field. Mud climbed her stockings to the knee in a hard, dark crust that had dried and cracked and dried again with the walking. One borrowed boot had lost its buckle somewhere near the 2nd mile. She had known it and kept walking anyway, because stopping would have meant arriving later still, and later, she had understood with the flat clarity of the truly desperate, was the only sin this room would not forgive. She was breathing as though she had run the distance rather than walked it. Her hair had come loose in wet strands against her throat. She looked, more than anything, like a woman who had fought something and was not yet certain she had won. The silence lasted exactly as long as silence ever lasts in a room full of people who have been waiting to be entertained. Good heavens! The voice came pitched to carry, and it carried, sailing over 300 heads to the vaulted ceiling and back down again like something thrown deliberately to strike. Lady Everard did not rise from her pew, only turned her head, her fan half lifted as though to shield herself from a smell. Surely someone might have washed the creature before permitting her near consecrated stone. One does not receive a bride, one receives, apparently, a chimney sweep. The laughter that followed was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the congregation in a low, rippling murmur, handkerchiefs lifted to hide smiles that did not trouble to hide themselves particularly well, a sound made of dozens of small, private satisfactions finding one another in the dark of the nave. Someone repeated the word, "chimney sweep," under their breath, delighted with it, as though they meant to carry it out into the county before nightfall. She did not run. She had thought, walking those last 100 yards with her lungs on fire, that if she reached the doors at all, she would want nothing more than to disappear through them backward. And yet standing here now, mud-crusted and breathless, and looked at by every eye in Thornmere's chapel, some stubborn, exhausted thing in her chest refused to let her drop her gaze to the floor. She lifted her chin instead, and looked, for the first time, down the long aisle toward the altar, toward the man everyone called a monster, who had not yet turned to see what the doors had brought him. He had not turned. That was the thing the whole chapel would remember afterward, when they told it over card tables and in drawing rooms up and down the county, that he had stood with his back to the doors through the worst of it, through the carriage story that had surely reached him already, in some whispered relay from the vestibule, through the laughter, through the word that was already being polished for repetition. He stood with his back to her, and his shoulders set like a man bracing for weather, and then, slowly, he turned. He did not look at his aunt. He did not look at the rows of silk and superior amusement on either side of the aisle. He looked at the girl in the doorway, with her hem black to the knee, and her hands raw from gripping the strap of a bag she had carried 4 miles alone, and something crossed his face that no one present had ever reported seeing there before. Not at his first wedding, not at his second, not in the 3 years since either. It was not pity. Pity she could have borne, pity she had braced herself for the way one braces for rain. This was something quieter and far more dangerous to her composure, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this: a woman arriving ruined and upright, rather than pristine and cowed. He came down the nave. He did not hurry, and he did not, this once, attempt to hide the limp that dragged at his left leg with every step. The old wound that gossip had draped in a dozen lurid explanations over the years, a duel, a fall from a horse, a wife's fury, none of them true. The congregation watched him cross the stones in silence now, the laughter dying the way laughter does when it senses it has misjudged its moment, and by the time he reached her the chapel held nothing but the small, terrible sound of his uneven footsteps and her own held breath. He did not speak to her. He did not ask permission, nor announce his intention to Lady Everard, nor spare a glance for the vicar's stricken face. He knelt. He knelt on the cold stone before the whole of the assembled ton, before peers and their wives and the aunt who had suggested she be washed like linen before she was fit to be touched, and he drew a handkerchief from his coat, plain linen, monogrammed, the sort of thing a man carries for his own use and not for display, and he began, with a care that made her breath catch somewhere beneath her ribs, to wipe the mud from her borrowed boots. No one laughed now. No one, for one long, suspended moment, said anything at all. She had not known, until that moment, that a person could be looked at so thoroughly and still be permitted to remain standing. All her life she had been looked past, by suitors who counted her dowry before they counted her virtues, by her father across a dinner table cluttered with unpaid bills, by sisters, cousins, aunts who found her useful only for the errands a plain girl could be trusted to run quietly. She had learned to make herself small in rooms, so that no one would have the trouble of noticing her at all, and here was a man on his knees before the whole of the watching ton, ruining a good handkerchief on the hem of her borrowed boots, noticing nothing else in the world. He did not look up at her while he worked. That, too, she would remember, that he did not seek her gratitude, did not glance for it the way men sometimes did when performing a kindness they wished witnessed. His jaw was set the way stone is set, unmovable, and the muscle at his temple ticked once, twice, with the effort of the position his leg could not have made easy. When the mud was gone, or gone as far as mud ever truly goes, he rose, slowly, one hand briefly finding the end of the nearest pew for balance, a small betrayal of the limp the whole room pretended not to watch for, and only then did his eyes come to hers. He said nothing. She said nothing. The vicar, recovering some scrap of his composure, cleared his throat into the enormous silence and began again, his voice unsteady in a way it had not been before, and the words of the ceremony fell over her like rain she had already walked through once that morning, solemn, unhurried, entirely beside the point. She said, "I will," in a voice she did not recognize as her own, thin from the walk, from the cold, from the astonishment still lodged somewhere beneath her collarbone. He said his own vow low and even, a voice made for reading ledgers, not romance, and yet she found she was listening to it the way one listens for a door that might, after all, open. Neither of them wept, neither of them smiled. When it was done, there was no triumphant swell of the organ, no eager crush of well-wishers pressing forward, only the peerage of England exchanging looks they did not dare voice aloud, and Lady Everard's mouth pressed into a thin, furious line at the front pew. Rosalind did not look at her. She was looking instead at the man beside her, at his profile, at the handkerchief he had folded once and returned, without ceremony, to his coat, as though he had done nothing more remarkable than close a window against the draught, and wondering, with the first flicker of something she did not yet dare call hope, what manner of monster he could possibly be. Thornmere Abbey, it turned out, was a house built for two people to disappear into entirely. She learned its shape the way a blind woman learns a room, by the cold that pooled in certain corridors, by the particular silence of the east wing where she slept, and the west wing where he did not sleep so much as vanish, some nights, into the estate ledgers until the candles guttered. They did not dine together. They did not, in those first weeks, exchange more than the barest civilities required to keep the household from remarking upon it, though of course the household remarked upon it regardless, in the way households always do, in glances passed between footmen and a housekeeper's carefully neutral face. And yet, the boots she had walked those 4 miles in, ruined, she'd thought, beyond any mending, the leather split at the heel and stiffened with dried mud, appeared outside her door on the 4th morning, restored, not new, not replaced with some finer pair that would have announced itself as charity, as correction, as a husband ashamed of what his wife had arrived in. Only mended, the stitching small and careful, clearly done by hands that knew boots, and not by hands that knew, or cared, whose boots they were. She stood in her doorway a long moment holding them, turning them over, before she understood that no one was going to tell her who had ordered it done, and that this, too, was deliberate. The fire in her grate was another such silence. She had not asked for it lit before she woke, had not, in a house so vast and understaffed as her father's had become in its last ruinous years, ever expected such a thing as a matter of course. And yet each morning she woke to warmth already established in the room, the coals settled, the chill already driven back from the corners, as though some unseen hand had gone before her into the day and made it a degree kinder than it might otherwise have been. And her meals came, she noticed, at hours she actually kept. Not the fashionable lateness of London tables, nor the rigid formality she'd braced herself for, but timed, she slowly realized, to when she herself rose, when she herself lingered, as though someone had been watching her habits closely enough to know them before she knew she'd formed them. She asked the housekeeper once, carefully, who had given the order regarding the fires. The housekeeper's face did the thing faces do when they have been instructed not to answer, and said only that His Grace was particular about draughts. Rosalind said nothing further, but she began, without quite deciding to, listening for his step in the corridor at night, for the uneven rhythm of it, the limp she had not yet had the courage to ask about, the way one listens, in a house full of silence, for the sound of a door that has not yet opened, but might. It was a letter that undid the silence first, not his, not addressed to her at all, but tucked into the lining of a writing box she'd been given to use, forgotten there by whoever had last owned the room. The hand was a woman's, fine and looping, and the date on it was 11 years gone. "I have not seen my husband in 4 months." It read, "And my mother tells me a duchess ought not complain of loneliness, as loneliness is the price of the title." She should have set it down. She read it twice more instead, and then went looking, with the particular hunger of someone starved of information, for whoever might tell her the rest. The housekeeper did not want to speak of it. She could see that in the way the woman's hands went still over the linen she was folding, the way her mouth performed the shape of I couldn't say, "Madam," before any sound came out of it. But grief, kept long enough in a house, has a way of leaking through the walls regardless of what anyone intends, and by careful, patient asking, a question here, a silence allowed to stretch there, she gathered it in pieces, the way one gathers something spilled and precious off a floor. The first wife had been young, younger even than she was now, married for the joining of two old names and nothing warmer than that. He had gone abroad that first year, some business of his father's estate, unavoidable, the housekeeper said, though her eyes said she did not entirely believe her own defense of him, and in his absence, the girl's own family had kept her close and cold, writing to her of duty and writing nothing of comfort, until whatever illness took her had found no strength left to fight it. He had come home to a house already in mourning. He had not, the housekeeper said carefully, ever quite forgiven the house, or perhaps himself, for what he had not been there to prevent. The second, that grief was easier to speak of, because it wore no blame. A lingering illness, slow and merciless, and him at her bedside for weeks past any reasonable hope, refusing physicians who told him gently to prepare himself, reading to her long after she could no longer answer. He did not leave that room for 11 days at the end of, the housekeeper said, and then seemed to regret having said it, and busied herself again with the linen. Rosalind sat a long while that evening with the letter in her lap, not reading it, only holding it, while the fire someone had lit for her without being asked burned low and orange against the dark. She understood now what the limp might mean, and what the silence between them might have been built from. Not coldness at all, but a man keeping careful, practiced distance from the one thing he had twice failed to save. The dinner had been 3 weeks in the planning, though no one had asked her opinion of a single course. Lady Everard had seen to the guest list herself, had chosen the candles, had decided, over the housekeeper's quiet protest, that the new Duchess ought to be introduced to society properly, before the whispers curdle into something worse. Rosalind understood by then what such kindness from that particular quarter usually concealed. She wore the gray silk that had been let out at the seams to fit her, the only gown fine enough for the table and plain enough to be, she thought, unremarkable. She had not accounted for how loudly plainness could speak in a room built entirely of ornament. 22 guests sat down to venison and hothouse fruit under candlelight that turned every diamond at every throat into a small, deliberate accusation, and she felt the gray silk grow heavier with each course, as though the mud of that first morning had never truly washed out of it. Lady Everard waited, as she always did, until the second remove, when the wine had loosened the table into something hungrier. "How economical you are, my dear," she said, to no one and everyone, her eyes moving down Rosalind's bodice with the frank cruelty of a woman counting coins. "One might almost think you'd worn that same gown to your wedding, were it not so much cleaner, though I suppose a girl raised among her father's creditors learns early not to waste good silk on show." A ripple went round the table, not laughter exactly, but its cousin, the small, delighted intake of breath of people who have paid for a performance and feel it finally beginning. Someone's fork paused above their plate. Someone else leaned toward their neighbor, already composing the sentence they would carry to the next drawing room. Rosalind felt the old, familiar instinct rise in her, to shrink, to apologize with her posture if not her words, to make herself smaller so the room might forgive her for existing in it. "Your father's debts were, I believe, quite considerable," Lady Everard went on, warming to it now, glancing round to be sure her audience was hers. "It is a wonder any bank would extend the family a farthing. One does wonder what a man sacrifices, marrying into such a history. A title is not so easily untangled, once it's been dragged through. Aunt. The Duke had not raised his voice. He had barely raised his eyes from his glass. But something in the single word closed over the table like a hand over a candle flame, and the ripple of anticipation curdled, all at once, into something else, a held breath, a table full of guests suddenly very interested in their venison, sensing, the way a room always senses these things, that the spectacle they had come for was about to become a different one entirely. He set down his glass. The small sound of crystal meeting linen seemed, in that silence, almost violent. He rose. It was not a swift motion. It never was, with him. The legs saw to that. The old wound making a slow ceremony of every rising, every crossing of a room. But there was nothing in it now of apology, none of the careful economy with which he usually moved through a world that watched him for weakness. He stood as a man stands when he has decided, finally, to stop being careful. "My first wife," he said, to the table, to his aunt, to the candlelight itself, died because her own family thought her worth less than the alliance she'd bought them, and I did not act quickly enough to save her from that arithmetic. My second died of an illness no physician could master, and I sat by her a year and watched, and could do nothing but watch." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "They call me a man who buries brides, and they are not wrong, only they have never once asked what it cost me, or what I swore over the second grave, which was that I would not stand by again, not for anyone bound to my name, and let her be made small." Lady Everard's mouth had gone thin and colorless. No one at the table was eating. He turned, found her, the only face in the room he seemed, in that moment, able to see. "I would be glad," he said, and here, for the first time, something in his voice roughened, came loose from its long discipline. "If you would take supper with me, not tonight only, going forward, if it does not displease you." Not a command. She understood the difference even as her heart understood it before her mind did, understood that a duke did not ask his duchess anything as a rule, and that this small breach of rule was itself the whole of what he was offering her. She rose. Her hem, she noted distantly, was clean tonight, unmarked by any road. Her boots, mended by his order, made no sound on the floor as she came round the table to him, past the frozen assembly of the ton, past the aunt whose triumph had curdled into something she would spend all winter pretending had never happened. She took his offered arm. They walked out together, the Duke and the woman who had once arrived at her own wedding with mud to the knee, and behind them the great dining room fell into a silence so complete it might almost have been mistaken for reverence, a room, for once in its glittering, whispering history, with absolutely nothing to say.